a group of around 25 Afghan women staged a protest in Kabul on Saturday, calling on foreign nations not to formally recognize the Taliban government ahead of a United Nations summit set to take place next week. The protest took place in defiance of a crackdown on dissent by the Taliban, who have been beating or detaining those who oppose their rule, including women who have protested for their rights. Despite this, small groups of women have continued to stage sporadic gatherings, and the women who protested on Saturday were able to do so without confrontation with security forces. The Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in 2021 after the United States withdrew its forces from the country. Since then, no nation has recognized the Taliban government as legitimate. A previous Taliban government, which ruled from 1996 to 2001, was only granted formal recognition by Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. The issue of whether or not to recognize the Taliban government is deeply divided among diplomats, NGOs, and aid agencies. Some believe that the international community might be able to persuade the Taliban to reverse curbs on women's rights by offering recognition, while others believe that even discussing recognition would grant legitimacy to a government that is squeezing women out of public life. The United Nations has announced that the de facto authorities of Afghanistan have not been invited to the Doha conference, and a spokesman for the world body said on Friday that recognition is not an issue. UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed said last week that envoys at the Doha meeting starting on Monday could discuss baby steps on a path to recognition, albeit with conditions. The Taliban clearly want recognition, and that's the leverage we have, she said in a talk at Princeton University. Protester Shomail Tawana Naziri, 26, told AFP that any discussion of formal recognition will give the Taliban motivation. For those of us who are oppressed, and our rights taken away, it increases our concerns, she said. The United Nations will also provide an update on aid operations, which have been hampered by a Taliban government order barring Afghan women from working for the world body, at Monday's meeting. The UN has said it faces an appalling choice over whether to maintain its huge operation in the country of 38 million people. The issue of recognition for the Taliban government is a complex one, with many factors at play. On the one hand, recognizing the government could give the international community more leverage to pressure the Taliban to respect women's rights and other human rights. On the other hand, recognizing the government could be seen as legitimizing a regime that has already shown itself to be oppressive and anti-democratic. Moreover, recognizing the Taliban government could have implications for regional stability and for the fight against terrorism. The Taliban have long been seen as a destabilizing force in the region, with links to extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda. They have also been accused of human rights abuses, including the suppression of women's rights and the targeting of ethnic and religious minorities. While the Taliban have made some public statements about respecting women's rights, many women in Afghanistan are skeptical about their intentions. There have already been reports of women being forced out of their jobs and schools, and of women being prevented from leaving their homes without a male guardian. Despite the challenges, the international community must continue to push for respect for human rights in Afghanistan, including women's rights. This means putting pressure on the Taliban to allow women to work and study, to respect their right to freedom of movement, and to protect them from violence and harassment. It also means supporting Afghan civil society organizations and women's groups, who are on the front lines of the fight for women's rights. As the Taliban regime consolidates its grip on power in Afghanistan, women's rights activists and advocates have continued to demand that the international community not formally recognize the Taliban government. These advocates fear that recognizing the Taliban could grant the group legitimacy, and signal to the world that the international community is willing to turn a blind eye to the abuses and human rights violations being perpetrated against women and girls in Afghanistan. The latest protest, which saw around 25 women march through a residential area in Kabul, came just days ahead of a United Nations summit in Doha, where envoys were set to discuss a durable way forward for Afghanistan. UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed said last week that while recognition of the Taliban government was not an issue on the agenda, the prospect of recognition could be used as leverage to pressure the Taliban into reversing curbs on women's rights. However, women's rights activists argue that even discussing the possibility of recognition only grants the Taliban government some legitimacy at a time when they are systematically squeezing women out of public life. Moreover, Some fear that any talk of recognition could motivate the Taliban to double down on their efforts to restrict women's rights and roll back the gains made over the past 2 decades. For many women in Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban to power has meant the loss of freedoms they had gained over the past 20 years. Under the previous Taliban government, which ruled from 1996 to 2001, women were banned from going to school, working outside the home, or leaving their homes without a male chaperone. They were also forced to wear burqas that covered their entire bodies. While the current Taliban leadership has said that women's rights will be respected in accordance with Islamic law, reports from the ground suggest that the situation for women and girls is rapidly deteriorating. Taliban authorities have already closed schools for girls in some parts of the country, and have imposed restrictions on women's access to healthcare and other services. In addition, women's rights activists and journalists have been subject to harassment, intimidation, and violence since the Taliban took control. In recent weeks, several female journalists have been beaten or detained while covering protests against the Taliban. The situation has led to a sense of desperation among many Afghan women, who fear that they will lose all the gains they have made over the past 20 years. Many are seeking refuge in neighboring countries, while others are trying to mount a resistance against the Taliban from inside the country. The international community, meanwhile, is divided over how to respond to the situation in Afghanistan. Some believe that the best way to protect women's rights is to engage with the Taliban government and push for reforms from within. Others argue that recognizing the Taliban would send the wrong signal and undermine efforts to protect women and girls. At the same time, aid agencies and NGOs are grappling with how to maintain their operations in Afghanistan, where millions of people are in need of humanitarian assistance. The Taliban government has already barred Afghan women from working for the United Nations, which has led to fears that aid operations will be hampered. In a statement issued on Friday, the United Nations said it faced an appalling choice over whether to maintain its huge operation in the country of 38 million people. The statement called on the Taliban to allow humanitarian workers full, safe and unhindered access to those in need.